Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University, and welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight's special event in recognition of Women's History Month, a new book just published yesterday, already reviewed in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, How to Think Like a Woman, 4 Women Philosophers Who Taught Me How to Love the Life of the Mind. And its author is Regan Penaluna, and we have as our guest tonight, our special guest, Regan Penaluna. Regan, welcome.
Hi, Thane. Great
Very
to be
excited to talk to you about this. There's so much in here, and we'll get a lot out in the next hour. If you're watching us live on YouTube, we love that. We welcome you. Don't forget to sign up for email announcements on folks.org, so you'll hear about future events and even get notifications about how this event gets archived. If you have a question for Regan, leave it in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll get to it. Regan, so this is a book, it's fascinating in many ways because it really is about women who were overlooked or altogether erased from the philosophical canon. It's a book that is many things. First of all, it's not an academic book of academic jargon, so our audience should know it's a great, fun read. And in many ways an important read, but witty and literary. One could call it a literary memoir because, Regan, you are very much in this book and you're very revealing in this book. And it's also, of course, biography of these 4 women, and even mini biography of many other women from around the world, which was sort of another double bonus. And I guess in some ways you could say that it captures the gamut of feminist issues and voices, especially as it relates to academia, and especially as it relates to the philosophical canon. So let's just start off with a simple thing. If you can just give us the name of the 4 women who are featured in the book, and just something briefly, just tell us what's interesting about them and why they were in your book and why they should be read currently by people studying philosophy.
Sure. So the 4 women I discuss are from the early modern period to early Enlightenment, and they're all British. That was my area of specialization in graduate.
So the reason this is important, I just want to make sure, is because you would say they're contemporaries of the men of the Enlightenment?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So these are contemporaries of, starting with John Locke, René Descartes, all the way through to Rousseau. So we have Mary Astle and Damaris Masham, Catherine Coburn, and the better known, Mary Wollstonecraft. Although
I only know her daughter,
Mary Shelley. That's
yeah,
right.
Frankenstein.
Exactly, the author of Frankenstein.
The author of Frankenstein. And I had reviewed a book many years ago for the LA Times. It was a novel about Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Bysshe Shelley spending a summer together and coming up with a game to come up with their best horror story. And she wins with that one. Anyway, go ahead.
So I'll say a few things about them, although I do think the context, giving a little context first, might be helpful to really appreciate what I found interesting. And I focus a lot on their feminist ideas, what they think about the condition of women. These women had a lot of ideas about metaphysics and epistemology too, but my book is really trying to pull out what philosophers have ignored, which tends to be the woman condition and feminist ideas.
And so, and each of them contribute to that idea, right? That the absence of women, which is so, if anyone took a look at the canon, they'd go, wait a minute, these guys don't seem to be interested in the life of the mind when it comes to women, nor do they seem to think that women add anything to the conversation of human understanding, right?
Correct. So, the history of philosophy is often described to be the field of dead white men. And that's what I learned about it entering the field. And I expected that, and I was okay with that. I still wanted to study the great minds. And so I was shocked to learn that, in fact, it's not the field of dead white men, or not just the field of dead white men. It's the field of dead white women, women of color, many different philosophers. So my book is a way to highlight these voices, in particular, the voices of the women who were there all along from the very beginning, which blew my mind. So, but let me say a little bit about the early modern, the context of the early modern, early Enlightenment period that these women were working and thinking in. This was a time in which women were not allowed to go to university. And the education of women, even at the elementary level, was very different from that of boys. Boys would be learning more serious subjects. They'd be learning classics, the humanistic tradition, whereas girls would be taught to memorize things, often their catechism. They would spend time learning domestic tasks. So their education was very different. And this period was also a moment of incredible change, exciting change. The great thinkers of the time, Rene Descartes and John Locke, were arguing that human reason can work really well without invoking God. And it's not that God doesn't matter, but that we can investigate the world without needing to bring in the divine will.
And of course, just to tell the audience, right, this is huge, right? That is not a small thing. That's huge. The break away from the divine was huge. It almost like you could, I think in the book you point out that it's tantamount to Newton's, theories of the physical universe, right? That this is so gigantic. Think of it that way, right? That the untethered with the God and the idea of the mind itself coming to grip with reflections, sensations, emotions, right?
Precisely. And this was really important too, in that some of the takeaways of this is that pretty much anyone with reason can access truth, right? And so custom was being questioned, authority was being questioned, teachers were being questioned, even universities were being questioned. So there were great thinkers who were stepping outside of the university. John Locke was one of these. He had a post at Oxford, but he
never went to college, right?
He spent time away from the university.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to be there because it was flooded with Aristotelianism, this ancient philosophy, this ancient science, and these men wanted to develop a new science, a new way of thinking, one that wasn't affected by these ancient ideas that they felt were very outdated, and they were. But the ancient ideas that they didn't question were those having to do with gender and women's inferiority.
And patriarchy.
Unfortunately.
And patriarchy.
Exactly. The patriarchy. And so
they were very dismissive. At one point, you have this, it's fascinating. You roll through everybody, Spinoza, David Hume, Hegel. You don't let anyone off the hook. And if a person wants to learn a little about the canon, this book is really terrific because it's a little primer on a number of philosophers that everyone knows of, but doesn't know enough about them. And you give them just a taste. And then you go, oh, and guess what they said about women? Right. Guess what? They didn't think much of the woman's mind.
Well, so my specialty was the history of philosophy, and I love the history of philosophy, and I love these great texts by these great male thinkers. They're incredible. And when I was studying, I was, I learned to dismiss the ideas, the sexist ideas, the racist ideas as just sort of these blemishes on otherwise beautiful.
So the point is, you were not unaware of them. You were not unaware of them. And the reason I'm saying this is important is I think most people don't know that there are not that many women who get PhDs in philosophy. So that means you were usually among a very handful of people in the class. And so you were clearly standing out, and you must have clearly felt that.
Definitely, I felt that, yes. When there was one time when a professor actually questioned point blank why there are so few women in philosophy, and that as philosophers, it was our duty to not be influenced by political correctness and to truly ask whether it's because we are inferior. And I looked around and there was one other woman in the room. It's like, okay, in a room full of men. That was a bit shocking. And I didn't have a response because I hadn't studied feminist philosophy. I hadn't studied even a woman philosopher up to that point. And so.
But is it because at that time you thought there were none? or you were told there were none, or you knew that there must be somebody out there?
I knew, of course, there were 20th century philosophers. I'd heard of Simone de Beauvoir. I heard of Hannah Arendt, but they weren't even taught in my program. But
well, they're not even taught now, right? You say something in the book that you were thumbing through a new book of the canon,
right?
And those philosophers aren't there; they're not there.
Yeah, this was a textbook, or not a textbook, an introduction to philosophy you would find in any bookstore for any
today.
Today, over 500 pages, and it was all the individual chapters devoted to a specific philosopher were meant.
So tell us just briefly, and then we'll get back to it. We'll flesh it out more. Just tell us briefly, each one of them, what did they add to this conversation? Because in as much as this is a book of biography, it does also make assumptions that these women had something interesting to say. And they were, in fact, contributing to the philosophical rhetoric and discourse of their time. And in some cases, they were read at some point and then forgotten.
Yes. Forgotten rather quickly after they died. So we could start with Mary Astle. I could just say a few things about her ideas, or do you want me to say a little about her life?
No, just her ideas.
Yeah.
Or why is that important to us? Although you can add to the fact, because it does seem to me that the reason I'm saying you don't need to do this now, because I want to get into this, it does seem to me that they all have certain things in common. Like their personal lives were very complicated. Their relationship with men was very complicated. Their relationship with people that dismissed them and didn't take them seriously, they reflect, it's heartbreaking in some cases, their attachments to men and how easily, like every human being, broken they were from, abandonment or sorrow or betrayal, that here are these geniuses who were very human. they ended up being very broken and, literally withdrew.
Yes. So I tell those stories. But, as for ideas, Mary Astle, so she was a rationalist. And by that, I mean, she believed that there were innate ideas and we access them through reason. She was profoundly influenced by René Descartes.
Right.
And René Descartes had this idea that our reason is separate, it is part of our soul, and that's separate from our body. And anybody can access this, the insights of reason. And by anybody, he didn't specify women, but Mary Astle took, the next step and said, women have reason too. And even though their bodies might be considered weaker than men's, it doesn't mean that their reason is. And in fact, they have a right to cultivate their reason. And so this was one of her big feminist insights. And she then proposed an all-female academy where women would have the proper conditions for them to cultivate their reason and learn this Cartesian, meaning Descartes' method. So their minds could become clear and they could have insights about themselves and about the world and be productive members of society once they were to leave this academy. The academy never came together, but
in fact, you say in the book, a number of them, some of them started schools, and then of course they failed. Like none of them are still with us. They all were experiments, and then for whatever reason ran out of funding.
Yes, I mean, Mary Astle did one day open a school, but this was not the dream female academy.
Right, that's not what she was talking about.
Yes.
Right.
It was an elementary school for very poor girls. So she was educating them, but
even that school closed.
That school closed, yes.
So Damaris Cudworth.
So she's an empiricist, and she believed that all ideas come to us through sensation and reflection upon those sensations. And so we have these simple ideas that we then combine into more complex ideas. The implication being that there are no innate ideas, that all of our ideas come to us through experience with the world. And in this, she was, she sided with John Locke in that tradition of empiricism versus rationalism. But she also held this idea that was very different from John Locke. So you probably know, right, that John Locke was a very important political theorist.
The rights of man.
The rights of man.
I mean, in fact, that's the paradox that you point out in your book, right? That here's a guy that is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equality, but he didn't think that was true of women. He thought they were inferior, right?
Right. Well, it's a little complicated. He had this idea that in the home, which, parental power would be shared equally between husbands and wives. So this was rather revolutionary. But he did qualify that. He said, however, if there is a dispute between the husband and wife,
break the tie.
The husband, right, who breaks the tie because he is quote unquote abler and stronger, right? So it's sort of like, okay, well, what's the point? Why bother giving them that freedom? So Damaris, she actually rejected this idea. She gave all power to women in the home, and she had this very dignified idea of motherhood. And she also, like Mary Astle, believed that women have a right to be educated so that they can be productive members of society. Astle wanted to get women out of the house. Masham doesn't, she doesn't say she necessarily wants them to all be mothers, but she focuses a lot on motherhood. And
the book, you point out repeatedly that these ideas that several of them present at different points, in addition to other women, one can imagine how threatening that is to society, right? I mean, this is very threatening, not just to male patriarchy, even women, right, were very dismissive of this.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is truly revolutionary that a woman was saying these things.
Absolutely. There was a fear that it would really upend the order of society. And it was difficult to be a woman thinking these things. And Masham writes about this, how she felt very uncomfortable. She felt her neighbors were staring at her, her pastor, everyone sort of looking at her, wondering, what is she going to do? Can they trust her?
And of course, there's intimations, you say in the book, accusations of lesbianism, accusations that they're actually men.
Yes.
Right? Crazy stuff.
Yes, but it's crazy, but the science of the time, that was codified in the science. So
I see.
If a woman is behaving in a way that is outside of the expectations of what a woman is, which is a nurturer, which is an inferior being to a man, if she is using her reason, or if she is using reason, if she is, having ideas, there was concern that she wasn't fully woman, all right? And she was they called them hybrids. Mm-hmm. And if her ideas were somehow useful to society, so not challenging the patriarchy, she would be celebrated as an ornament and a rarity. But if they did challenge the patriarchy, often these women received the charge of being monsters, literally monsters. And Astle was called a monster.
Catherine Trotter Coburn.
Yeah.
By the way, they're not related. That's no relationship to Bruce Coburn, the Irish writer who now lives in the United States. No. There's a husband and wife writer, Bruce. I forgot I actually believe that the actress Olivia Wilde is their daughter.
Okay.
And when I read this, I wondered, wait a minute, I wouldn't be surprised if that's if that's that family, a writer family. Anyway, so what I love about Trotter Coburn is that she's a playwright.
Yes.
Right. She starts off writing plays. And by the way, that's another thing that's important in this book, which is that almost all of them, yes, they wrote philosophy and they wrote about metaphysics, but they also wrote poetry, and many of them wrote novels or novellas, and some wrote plays. I mean, I think it's important to point out for readers that think, oh God, I don't want to know about philosophers. No, these were real public intellectuals. Let's not think of them as, turgid, jargony professors. No, these were women truly of the life of the mind, and they brought their feminine skill set with them, which meant that they thought, yeah, of course I should write a novel, and I should also write a book about philosophy.
Right. And I'm I'm a philosopher who believes that philosophy can take many forms. It doesn't have to take the form of the dry treatise. It can take the form of a novel. It can take the form of a poem. And these women often were not instructed in how to write a treatise. Well, these women did figure it out, but not all women were. And often women would write philosophical ideas in letters and things like this. So I think we have to attend to these other forms of literature to appreciate the philosophy of women.
Great point. Great point. And let me just add one other thing that you point out in the book, which is they didn't go to college. They were not given the same education as boys. But you say something that's extraordinary. You said many of them taught themselves Greek, Latin, mathematics, the very things they taught themselves. Some of them angled themselves closer to tutors or people that they could benefit from. You point that out, which shows a certain resourcefulness. You know, I understand I don't have access to stuff, but I'm going to try to get as much as I can.
Yeah.
Isn't one of them, what did you say? There's one of them actually was allowed to attend Cambridge, but had to be behind a curtain?
Oh, that's Anna Maria van Schermen, this Dutch philosopher. So she's a little bit younger, right? So earlier 1600s,
right?
But not much. And she's fascinating. And so she, women were not allowed to go to the university, but she was exceptionally brilliant. And her father noticed it when he was young and he was teaching his boys, and she would answer the questions from across the room that he was asking his sons who couldn't answer these questions. And so she ended up, writing a book of Ethiopian grammar, doing all these incredible things, writing treatises in defense of women's education. And, so she wanted to go to the university, and they said, we will make an exception for you, but if you do, you have to sit behind a curtain, right? Because you will disturb the men otherwise.
It's like Orthodox Judaism, a forced separation. You don't want to distract anybody. We don't want people whispering about you. You stay in the back.
Right.
And let's see, who have we gotten all of them, right? Yeah.
Wollstonecraft. We haven't talked about.
We haven't talked about Wollstonecraft, right? Mary Wollstonecraft, right? So, the one thing I remember that way, and then we'll move on. I just add one thing about her that I thought that there's a quick witty moment in that description, I think, where she says something like, if you really want to know about women, you really should be reading women philosophers, right? That she's recognized that, the best people who can judge and interpret what it is, the feminine mind, probably, again, against the notions of patriarchy, you should look to a woman. So let me just start off with this question. Are you surprised that all these centuries have gone by, right? Now that you're like literally a leading authority on women that nobody was paying attention to, and hopefully you brought them to the attention, and maybe we can push them into the canon or having courses about them in which this book is taught as part of the syllabus, let's hope. But when you look back on it now, do you go, I can't even believe that we're talking about 500 years ago, this is not yesterday, it's not 100 years ago, that all this time, that not only did we not know about them and others, but we haven't even the ones that people supposed to know about don't know about it? Or are you saying, Thane, if you read my book, you'll learn, of course, it makes total sense. The system is set up to not allow barriers to entry for women.
Yes, I mean, it blows my mind that it's 500 years ago, and that we don't know them. And then what blows my mind is there are people who try to resurrect them over and over, and these people are even lost. So the historians, the biographers of these women, and there were many, and there were men who were like, how is this happening? Why is there this attrition of women, great women thinkers and writers? And it's to call it a system, it's strange. I feel like it's so subtle, right? I feel the way that patriarchy works, the way that women's writings and ideas are suppressed, it's kind of like this unconscious habit of our culture. And, women are just erased, they're considered crazy, or their works are miscategorized, right?
But you could in college take a course in English literature and devote yourself entirely to women, and you'd be really busy. you'd have a lot of coursework to cover. So I'm
Right.
saying, is there something about philosophy that creates barriers to entry that are beyond the world of writing novels or writing literary criticism or doing other things, including, Madame Curie, right? I mean, could we argue that it would have been easier to get a Nobel Prize in chemistry than it would have been to get a teaching position at Yale, in the 19th century?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it that way, but that's pretty interesting. I mean, there were women philosophers doing things, but I think that why philosophy? Why was it a surprise to me?
Right.
Why was it a surprise to me that there were women philosophers, right? In a way that in English, it's not surprising. There was Jane Austen, there were, incredible, I get it.
And by the way, you mentioned Virginia Woolf, who knew of some of them, right?
Yes.
And was reading some of them. And so that to me brought it really home, that she investigated, she found, she knew what she should be looking at.
Right. But she even says, it's that it's unfortunate that they've been lost, and she found out about them because of some 1915 dissertation at Columbia University.
Yeah.
And that 1950 dissertation at Columbia University is indebted to this 1751 biography by George Ballard of great women writers. And that text is also itself very obscure.
He's actually one of, I don't want to talk about him much, but he was one of my favorite characters in your book.
I love George.
He's to me a hero. If you read the book, you can't walk away and go, all right, who comes across as really, heroic? He does.
Absolutely. Right. And I like elevating the men who are sympathetic.
Yes. It reminds me of something that I read that Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said. Mm-hmm. She said, I hired women who were married and had children to reward the husbands that knew that for the year that the wife was going to be working for me, he had to be the mother. And feminists, if you're a real feminist, you have to reward that man who says, I want my wife to be working for the Supreme Court and I'm going to do everything I can. And I love that she picked up on that we have to reward that husband who makes that possible.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about you, because you're in this book. There's an anecdote here that you throw out and you don't jump on it a lot. I don't know if it was for delicate readers to wonder or whether you didn't want to go further. And you could tell me to shut up and you don't want to talk about it anymore. But you say, I mean, you're this precocious girl reading stuff, know from the beginning that the great books is something you want to be involved in. And so when you say at one point, somewhere toward the end, I think, you say, when I was a freshman in a great books class, I was one of the chatterboxes. Mm-hmm. I was actually one of the ones that wasn't shutting up.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what happened to you? It reminded me of Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice, mm-hmm. where she says something happens to girls when they reach the age of 9 or 10. Right, where before they're 9 or 10, the girls are out racing the boys. They're better at the boys and everything. And then something happens through social conditioning where there's an oppression and a suppression, and the girls start to retreat and withdraw. And I'm saying, wow, little Regan Penaluna certainly didn't have that. She pops up in freshman year, but yet something happens over time. You are very revealing attachment to men. Things that cues you were picking up by people criticizing your work and making you doubt yourself. You have this really cool chapter on demons talking to you. Like what were the demons inside my head and what kinds of shitty, nasty things did they say to me that messed with my head? And I love that. It's a very artful moment in the book. So I'm wondering what do you think happened? Do you think that this is something that is idiosyncratic to women, to a certain woman? Or do you think that, like the women philosophers with whom your life intersects with, this is inevitable? This is exactly what should happen. Nobody is impervious to this.
Well, I do think some women are impervious. I do think there are some types that get through, and it doesn't bother them. And
I'm not hearing any noise, right? They're saying,
yeah,
I'm not hearing you and you're not
right.
messing with my project.
And more power to them, like fantastic, right? It's great. You made it through that filter of patriarchy.
Right.
And I celebrate them, and that's wonderful. But that certainly wasn't what it was like for me. I'm really sensitive to those cues. I think a lot of women are, to those cues of the doubt other people have about you. And yeah, so it started to happen for me in college. I started to feel very self-conscious
In philosophy courses.
in philosophy courses, right? And in graduate school, it was just exacerbated. There were, very few women, right, in the program. So sometimes it was just a room full of guys and me and one other woman.
And you actually described something that I found really horrifying, literal prejudice, that the attention was given to the boys, the class, the graduate students who were men,
yeah,
that they just didn't bother with you, as if to say, even when it came to criticism that you could have benefited from,
yeah,
they didn't tell it to you until the end, when it was too late, that you
right.
could have benefited, you could have incorporated it, but they never bothered to make a note. You know what? Call Regan, make a note, call Regan, bring her in here, tell her a few things.
Right. Well, there was a concern. There had been an issue of sexual harassment in the department before I arrived. And so a lot of the professors were being careful. And I get it, right? You don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. But, so what happened is they were being very careful around the women, not going out and getting drinks and hang out. But they would do that with the men, the male graduate students. And so these small little things, right, make a huge difference in sending someone the signal that they belong and giving them feedback on their ideas. And I became very self-conscious and, wondering whether I even belonged, whether I was good enough to be there. And so I started to not look for, not to share my ideas. And the one person I did share them with was a teaching fellow, right, and who I fell in love with and eventually married and then divorced. But I ended up looking for validation through that relationship, and everything else seemed very terrifying to me.
So in some ways, that relationship mirrored some of these philosophers as well, because many of them that you point out were in a relationship that was clearly had a hierarchy, who was really in charge of the relationship. And also just, where there was very strong attachments and not a real strong feelings of autonomy and independence.
Right. Well, I mean, I love thinking about Damaris Masham. I mean, she was in a long, relationship, friendship, very flirtatious, romantic relationship with John Locke, right? And he's over twice his age. And, and definitely that was very validating and intimidating at the same time. And it gave her great insecurity when she had to perform for him and try to, speak to him, write to him philosophically, solve problems. But at the same time, it also did give her some nerve to stick around and do philosophy.
Let me ask you something about that point. You just reminded me.
Yeah.
I wonder, I think I know what you would answer this. So what are we to make of their relationship? Because you started off by saying context matters. You said, I want to set up the time period. And I'm glad you did. That was a good, important thing. This is the time frame of the Enlightenment. So to the extent to which some of the great philosophers did read things, not necessarily treatises, but letters, because you did point out that a lot of them corresponded and had, philosophical conversations through letters with the great white men. Are we to say, in evaluating, because you read them all, you're like one of the few people that read all those books, all those letters, you read them all. Are we to say the issue here is much more about, sort of feminist philosophy and history of the women in academia? Or would you say, no, that's not what this is about? This is about adding on, truly adding on to the conversation and benefiting philosophical discourse at the time. In other words, that we could almost say that their relationships benefited the great men, that it was not just some perfunctory, boyish crush. They weren't humoring these women. They were actually in conversation with these women, right? I'm just saying it's important to say, is this about the history of feminism? Or we're going to say, no, this stands on its own. The ideas of this women are important on their own. You would agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would agree. These women bring a really important critical edge to these great Enlightenment thinkers. They're bringing up issues that we often describe as postmodern, and this was happening much earlier. This was happening contemporaneous with these Enlightenment thinkers, this questioning of whether rights are ultimately the good that we should be seeking, whether we should be concerned about responsibility to others too. All these women actually believe that was very important, that rights overemphasized selfishness and it didn't emphasize community and altruism enough.
And as you point out, one should not be surprised that that would be a feminist perspective, a woman's perspective, a nurturing, emotionally giving, caretaking that, and I've often said that, Thomas Jefferson takes life, liberty, and property and calls it life. He takes Locke's life, liberty, and property and switches property to pursuit of happiness. And I always say to people, that is a very aggressive shift. Pursuit is a really intense verb, I mean, to pursue happiness, not happiness, but to go run and get it. Right. So you could say that there is something about that introducing this idea of rights and responsibilities, right? That there's a moral dimension, not just a legal one, but a moral dimension. You don't ask for rights unless you're feeling you deliver a reciprocal responsibility. And you're saying women would do that.
Yes, but what's interesting is they didn't all agree that this was essential to women. Like men actually can do this. Men actually have the capacity to be more altruistic, right? They just have to exercise it a bit more. And Catherine Coburn was interesting, and she said, and you know what, women can be a little more selfish, right?
Right, exactly, right. I love that.
Yeah.
So, one thing this book made me think about was that are we reading the wrong things when people rush off to Barnes and Noble or bookstores to the self-help section? Because it does seem to me that one thing that comes out of your book is that the good life, right? What's the big philosophical question, right? Where am I? Who am I? And how do I attain the good life? And what would the good life look like? Those big questions, people should not run away. Those are questions that philosophers grapple with from the ancient Greeks on. And so that, maybe, too dry to read, Plato, maybe, but to know that that's at heart what's going on. And that maybe, especially the women philosophers were really sort of the self-help gurus of their day, right? That they had introduced an element to philosophy that was missing with the men. And I wonder whether that's something that you think that might be true, that it also made them taken not as seriously, but in fact, they were asking much larger questions. Like, for instance, can I be a woman and a thinker at the same time? Can I fulfill mutual duties of motherhood and wife, domestic partnerships, and at the same time not lose myself and my mind?
Right. Exactly.
And nobody was doing, no man was doing that.
Not for women. That's true. They were very interested in how to live the good life. This is a question that motivated all four of the women that I focus on. And they were very interested in bringing women into that fold. What does it mean to live a good life as a human, as a woman in this society?
So we hear all the time about movements on campus, critical race theory. A lot of people don't know what those things are, but they hear things like intersectionality, critical race theory, gender and queer studies. Those movements, even those movements, have been, ineffectual in shifting the thinking of the canon on philosophy. In other words, you would think that given what we hear about campus, that something in the philosophy section would have that. They would have a simply like critical race theory or like queer studies, have something to say, look, we're taking over this department. You know, these things are patriarchal, they are sexist, they are any number of things that are just bad.
Right.
By the way, in answering this question, I think you should probably tell the audience, it doesn't seem to me that you're opposed to the great books by great white dead men, right? You lived off of them, you don't dismiss them, you do consider them the great philosophers. You are not a radical philosopher who would say, if I were to envision a course, we wouldn't read any white guys.
Correct. No, those texts are great, and we read them because they are important and necessary. I just think that we need to introduce a greater sense of humanity into the canon itself, and so broaden the sort of lines of inquiry that we consider to be philosophical. I find it really strange that critical race theory and feminism are treated as marginal and as electives. It's so strange to me when these are just fundamental human issues and questions, all related to the good life, all related to justice, metaphysics, epistemology. These are all related to that. Why are they getting, set to the side?
Could you answer that maybe in the same way that 500 years ago, people just felt threatened by women philosophers? Because like some of them were much more open about sexuality, right? And so one could imagine really in the 17th century, yeah, according to Regan Penaluna's book, some of them were writing about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a long time ago. And you can imagine how threatening that was to the church and to male patriarchy. And I'm wondering whether the academy, or even when it comes, because I like what you just said, I made it sound like these things are huge movements on campus, but you're saying they're still marginalized.
Yeah,
they're still electives.
Right. When it comes to most programs, not all, but most programs, definitely this.
But you taught these women in your classes, no?
Yes, but not in in a regular course, right? So this was evolving for me. I taught a feminist philosophy course, and they were taught in this. And I taught a course on the human condition. And
did you have to teach a great books class and you had to fight to get one of them in?
I never had that problem. No, as a professor, I had freedom. So I taught them in an early modern class, right? But generally they're not taught, and it's because people don't know about them. They don't understand how to integrate them into early modern philosophy. Early modern philosophy often focuses mostly on questions of epistemology and metaphysics, and that sort of setup is pretty traditional. It goes from Descartes, Locke to Kant to Hume is in there, right? And then it ends. And
although you do say in the book that everything sort of begins in terms of what we understand philosophy, it's all Kantian. Like Kantian is king in your mind.
Right. And that it's what happened to universities. So after Kant, there were historians who dramatically transformed literally the canon of the history of philosophy. Before Kant, there was this incredible history by Johann Jakob Bruckner from 1742. And the first volume of his history of philosophy was Asian philosophy, African philosophy, Native American philosophy. That was volume 1. Greeks were volume 2, 1742, right? So there was a much more broad sense of what qualified as philosophy.
So what kicked his text out? What happened in this Kantian universe that someone put their fist down and said, this is not what we should be reading?
Well, Kant had this idea about what the project of philosophy is about. And it is about how does the mind grasp reality? How does it attach to the world? How do we know our world? And so Kant looked around and he said, well, Locke kind of started to answer this question, as did Descartes. They got lost along the way. I'm here, and he sort of perfected what he saw as the flaws in those empirical and rational approaches. And so Kant is a genius and very powerful. You read his works, he's amazing, right? And all the Germans were, blown away by this, and Germans were very good historians too. And so they said, let's create a history of philosophy that is based on this Kantian vision of empiricism, rationalism, leading up to Kant, who would then perfect the problems in those.
Fix the Descartes Lockean deficiencies.
Exactly.
Right, to fill that hole. And
right.
so that's
anybody else doing any other kind of philosophy focusing on human nature, that according to Kant is considered anthropology. So as you can imagine, women philosophers who are interested in the condition of women, that's not philosophy, that's anthropology.
I see. So that's another thing that happened, is if they're saying this isn't the subject on the table, exactly. Right? That is a subject. It's not this.
It's not a philosophical subject.
Right. It's right. And so and they somehow, Kant from that point on, now we're talking 300 years, right? They managed to keep this intact, that vision, all this time.
Right.
Without really any dissenters, because you would think, God, think about political theory, right? And think about what happens on campuses, right? From, postmodernism to, Marxism to decolonialism, which we see now, that somehow I find it remarkable. I didn't think about it until I read your book, that talk about, that they figured out a way to draw a moat around what they thought was the canon, and they didn't even have to fight anyone off. They watched they saw rebellions in every other department, but their own. And again, I find it remarkable.
Yes, I do too.
Let's just go back a little to the ancient. We'll just quickly ask. I want to just tell the audience, going back to ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle had different views. Just briefly tell us, right, in terms of where women fit into this.
So Plato had this idea that, if we look at Plato in the Republic, right, he has different ideas depending on which dialogue, but let's just stick with the Republic. And he believed that it's possible that women have souls similar to men in that they are capable of reason. But he, he even said they could be trained to be philosopher kings, but he amended that and said probably they'll be better as sort of their companions, or that is like an assistant, because their reason doesn't reach the heights of men's reason. So still, that's better than nothing, right?
Yeah. I'm overplaying Plato here, right? I always thought he was more progressive, but you're saying it's better, but it's not great.
And he allowed women in his academy.
That's what I thought, right?
He did, yes. There weren't a ton of them, but they were there. So then, you get to Aristotle. Wow. So that he's very different.
Wow.
And Aristotle was so influential. So, for 2 millennia after, he died, his idea of gender played out and was, just the main theory of women up and through past the Enlightenment. And so Aristotle essentially said that women were degenerates, inferior to men physically and intellectually.
Let's talk about you again. Let's go back. You are a writer, a journalist, an editor, and now an author of this really wonderful book. And by the way, for the audience, you can click on your chat box to purchase this book, and you should talk about it. This is a great book to talk about. What I want to ask you is, you're not teaching. I don't know, the book is clear. You take us through your journey as a young academic, what was available to you, what was available to a woman in the philosophy departments, and where you'd have to go to even chase them down, what kinds of contracts were being offered to you. And in the end, you just decided, you know what, I'm going to live in New York and be a public intellectual. And one of these days, there's going to be this kind of a book. And if you remember, this is a book that's written for the general public, right? And it's also a literary memoir. I watch you here for an hour on FOLCS, and I think, she's wonderful. Why is she not teaching? Wouldn't students benefit from this person? Now you could say, well, Thane, you and I didn't have that kind of a conversation. And I would say, yeah, but that's the kind of conversation that should be in a classroom, right? That there's nothing wrong with what we just did here in the last 15 minutes, right? As opposed to something where, everyone is asleep. So I'm wondering whether you've now had some time distance from the Academy. You've now published this book, which is almost a critique of the Academy, right? It's literary criticism of itself and its failure in this very important area of scholarship. You probably have some perspective now. Do you think that the Academy is just wrong in the way it understands its mission, and that it does just the way it structures itself? And believe me, I've spent I'm going to say something heretic, which is I often say something heretical. I mean, I would get rid of tenure. I mean, what? Yeah, immediately. Yesterday, I think that has been an awful outcome for people. It's good for faculty, but not good for people. But I'm saying there are critiques of the system, and I wonder whether you have one that, you gave up on a career that you might have wanted. Are you fulfilled in this career? Do you wish that it could be changed and you would go back? If it did go back, could you go back in some way, in this way? You might wind yourself back in by publishing books that make you so essential to teach books that are not the canon, but books like this that fall into the philosophy department and in women's studies, right? Different categories. So that's a lot of things to think about, but unwind that for us.
Yeah, I mean, it is a lot. And, I've thought a lot about it. I mean, although, I do think that, the way I present philosophy here, it's a generalization. It's not a universal claim. I don't think universities are monoliths, right? And there are really interesting programs out there. And since I've left, there's been a blossoming of scholarship on early women in philosophy, early women philosophers. And it's been a joy. And I see some people.
But it's not considered, what is it considered? In other words, it falls in the book section. It's not, is it in the philosophy? Is it in the biography department? Is it in the feminist theory? What is it?
It would be in, it depends on the period. So early modern studies of women philosophers, it's a group of women and they're really building this out. Duke University has this wonderful website called FOLCS. And it was actually founded by a man who's interested in early modern philosophy and couldn't believe that they were missing. And so they've been building it out and they've created like a wonderful internet resource.
In fact, I think they did an interview with you recently.
Yes. Yeah. Or I wrote a piece for them.
You wrote something. I read something somewhere. Yeah. You just reminded me.
So, I mean, there are pockets, right, where this is happening and it's really delightful. It's just hard to get a job in philosophy. There's too many of us that would want to do it, right? So would I want to do it? Sure, in a nurturing place. And I think there's more of these places now than there were. At the same time, Thane, I do feel that I've been exercising my literary muscles quite a bit and my biographical muscles, my historical muscles. And I don't know if I'm the perfect fit for a strict philosophy program, right? It's like, I really do love exploring these other sides of these thinkers. And so who's to say what that would look like in the academy, maybe a visiting post or something like this. But
go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say, I think universities are beautiful places intellectually. There's beautiful. There's a lot of incredible pleasure that comes from being devoted to the life of the mind. And I do miss that, but I get a lot of it through writing and thinking in the ways that I've been doing to create this book.
Do you know have you found a community of people who are even still in tenure track positions? Or would you say, Thane, it's so dire that in fact, I really don't know many women who are on the way to tenure in the philosophy department of a university? Or are there people reaching? I mean, do you expect people to reach out to you now?
I am friends with women who are tenured and who are or in tenure track positions. I know some who are brilliant and are just unable to find those positions, and who write about women philosophers. So I see them in all different forms. I see them as adjuncts too, and I see men as adjuncts. It's tough. It's tough to get into philosophy.
And you had originally had that role as well until they gave you I think a 4-year contract.
At St. John's.
But they didn't give you a sense that would result in anything beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, it was outside of their hands. You know, it's very expensive to have a tenure track job. It's a lot easier to pay adjuncts.
But now that you're, a New York intellectual who writes magazine pieces and now published this book, can you look at that and say, you know what? I actually think this is a more stimulating overall life. You spent a lot of time in the academy. You were married in it. You've traveled to conferences. You were part of that community, going to conferences. I'm wondering whether you as a refugee of that world, you can look back with perspective and say, I don't really miss it. This offered something else that I didn't even know existed, and it's cool.
I do feel that way. I feel I'm living the most rich intellectual life right now. I feel my mind has expanded by stepping outside of the academy.
All right, we'll take one question and we'll say goodnight to Regan. This comes to us from Keith Long. He says, Regan, would you say the 4 female philosophers you studied were, and I see what I think he's trying to ask here, were intellectually deplatformed by the male intellectual culture of that time? He's using, the social media language to say that, it's worse than being ridiculed, right? That they were just not allowed a platform at all.
Yes, and there are a lot of ways to do that. There were just theories, sexist theories, kind of codified in the science of the time. Mary Astle was frustrated because she used Cartesian language, just scientific language, right? That the world is made up of mechanical things, but also the soul, right? And this is the seat of reason. The mechanical things are inert, stupid. Women were often considered to be in this realm of machines, and that was her complaint. It's sort of the sexism takes all different sorts of forms to delegitimate their place in philosophy. I'm not sure if that answers the question exactly, but.
Before we say goodnight, can you tell that anecdote about Descartes and the doll? Do I have that right? Just tell that one. Just quickly tell that one. We'll say goodnight. Okay.
So Descartes fell in love with his mistress, and they had a baby. And he actually loved this child, and she ended up dying when she was about 5, I believe. And Descartes was actually quite heartbroken by this. And there's this legend, that that was already going around in the age of Descartes and outlived him, but that Descartes created a doll, a mechanical doll that he would take with him around anywhere on trips, and
representing the girl,
right? There's this story that I believe he was on a ship traveling, and it was just freaking out the sailors so much that they threw it overboard one night.
Given all the patriarchy and all the kind of disconnect that they had, to that other side of humanity, right? That anecdote is very telling. It is very revealing and very telling, right? That you can say what you want, but in the end, these very profound, deep sensations and emotions that you dismiss in the women are incredibly valuable to what it means to be a human being. And if you want to learn about humanity, that's part of it. All right, before we say goodnight to Regan, first of all, you were lovely, charming, wonderful, brilliant. And I'm recommending to our audience, which is a global audience, buy this book. Talk about this book, assign it for your book clubs. It's really a really great read. Before we say goodnight, Regan, don't forget folks.org, sign up for our email list. We have a lot of programs coming up that I won't give you any information about yet, but you'll find out through here. And also, we have throughout the pandemic, we have not charged. We want you to think of us as one of your favorite nonprofits. So a donation would be very much appreciated. Regan, quite an achievement, great accomplishment, and we wish you really great luck.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Until next time, good night.